Hello and welcome to Ipsy Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm Maybelle Romero, an assistant professor at the Northern Illinois University College of Law, and joining me today is Hannah Haksgaard, an associate professor at the University of South Dakota College of Law. Today we'll be discussing her new paper, Blending Surnames at Marriage, to be published in the Stanford Law and Policy Review this summer. And it's a really exciting paper. It starts off with a really fun sort of personal anecdote as to how you get really interested in this topic of blended surnames. Could you just relate that for our listeners, please?
Yeah, so my husband and I got married in 2015, and my maiden name was Haksgaard. His maiden name, or his previous last name, was Hackey. He invited me to be a Hackey. I invited him to be a Haksgaard. Neither one of us accepted, but we had a great conversation, and we sort of, after hashing out the details, decided to blend our names to become the first Haksgaard family. And that actually turned out to be the easy part, because then we had to figure out how we actually legally change our names from Hackey and Haksgaard to Haksgaard. Although we got married in South Dakota, that's where we had our wedding, you couldn't do it in South Dakota without going to a courthouse and doing an official name change procedure. Turned out in North Dakota, where we're actually living, it was really easy to do just by getting married. So we had a quick courthouse wedding, changed our names, and that sort of spurred my idea to write this paper.
That's awesome. So you really are the first Haksgaard family, though, it looks like, just reading through your footnotes and everything.
Yeah, we looked it up. Both Haksgaard and Hackey are Norwegian, and so Google turned up nothing on Haksgaard. We did a search on official Norwegian farm names, because that's where both of our original surnames come from, and there were no Haksgaard farms in Norway, so we are pretty sure that we are original.
That's awesome. Okay. So you're really lucky to be able to just travel to North Dakota, and you got married in the courthouse that you worked in, right?
Yes, I did.
That's great. And North Dakota is one of the 4 states, it sounds like, where you can actually just change your name and do a blended surname when you get married. What are the other states that do this currently?
So there's 4 states. So New York started allowing this sort of the blending surnames at marriage in 1985. North Dakota followed in 1993. And then in 2007, both Kansas and California updated their codes to allow blending surnames at marriage.
Okay, so it sounds like it was really convenient to be able to just go ahead and, blend your surnames when you wanted to, when you got married. But, couldn't you just take care of this through a normal name change petition? What's the big deal?
Yeah, so we absolutely could have. And there's also 3 other states, I should add, that allow you to choose absolutely any name you want when you marry. So Iowa, Massachusetts, and Minnesota say you can have absolutely any name you want. So if you're not in those 7 states, you can blend your surnames, but you have to go through the official name change process, and that means filing court documents. That means appearing in court, explaining to a judge that you're not being fraudulent as you change your name. In most states, it requires something like 4 weeks of publication. So it's possible you can do it everywhere, but it's not cheap. It takes time, it takes money, and a lot of people simply can just never get it done because they find it so complicated.
Yeah, I imagine that's a really complicated process. And I remember getting married, looking into the process of maybe getting my name changed, a few months after getting married. And I was at the Social Security office, and I remember them saying that there was a 5-hour wait to even meet with someone to do that. And I just gave up at that point. So I could understand that sort of inconvenience would be really off-putting to people.
Yeah, it is a huge inconvenience. I mean, you have to go through a level of inconvenience when you change your name to get your driver's license and your Social Security updated. But obviously, sort of the most difficult part is to the legal process of actually changing your name.
Yeah, that's even more onerous, it sounds like. So, this is a really exciting article because it's really the first to look at the American laws on surname blending at marriage. So could you give us maybe just a brief sort of overview of the history of surname changes at marriage in this country?
Yeah, so we like to think, or I think many of us assume, that it was legally required that men adopt, or that women adopt their husband's surname at marriage. That has actually never been true except in the state of Hawaii. So Hawaii, we have to think of different as sort of, colonialism is playing a role there. And they're sort of trying to Americanize the population by requiring wives to take husbands' names. In the rest of the states, there's never an explicit law that says a woman must adopt her groom's surname, except states would condition rights on it. So, for example, for a long time, you could not vote unless you use your husband's name, or you could not get a driver's license. So while you weren't required to do it, in order to fully participate in society, you sort of had to. By the 1960s, 1970s, women are pushing back. We sort of get into a mode where initially there's two options. There's change your last name or keep your own name. By the 1980s, it gets pretty popular to start hyphenating. And then in the 90s and 2000s, suddenly men start saying, wait, I want to change my name too. And not all states allow that. For example, South Dakota doesn't, where I did research on trying to get our names changed. But there's not been a long history of people blending surnames. Mm-hmm. It's generally been, at most, a woman keeping her own name at marriage.
Okay. So I'd just be curious, if you're willing to share, what were people's reactions, like, say, at the courthouse where you used to work, where your husband was trying to change his last name as well?
Yeah, so it was an interesting process. I actually started by just trying to look online. I am, at that point, a federal clerk. I have access to all of the good legal databases, and I know how to research laws, and I couldn't find anything in South Dakota that described their name change process. So the first thing I did when I sort of felt like I had run out of information is I just called the county courthouse in the county where we're going to get married, and I asked the guy, can we do this? Like, what does your marriage license say? And his response was basically he couldn't understand that I was asking that my husband might want to change his name too. It was an incredibly confusing conversation,
yeah,
right? Because it just took forever for him to understand, oh, wait, you're both changing your names.
Wow.
And so, that was kind of a dead end. At that point, I figured out sort of what the South Dakota system was, which is you never write down your chosen name on the marriage license. The marriage license just doesn't indicate it at all. In North Dakota, the law was clear, right? I read the state statute and I was like, okay, we can do this. We can take parts of Hackey and parts of Haksgaard and create Haksgaard. So it was pretty easy. We went to the county courthouse, told the woman what we wanted to do. And at first she was like, here, I'll take your names. I'll write it on the form. And then she did a double take of like, I need to make sure this is allowed. So it was funny. She went and actually got her little copy of the statute, mm-hmm. read it, and double checked that what we were doing was allowed. And of course it was, because I had read the statute.
Exactly.
And she sort of was like, well, I've never had to do this before, but that's cool. And the reaction by almost everyone has been, that's cool.
Yeah. But it's interesting that sort of automatic pause that you kind of run into. Yes. It seems to be really reflective of, you were just mentioning that, none of the states apart from Hawaii necessarily required women to adopt their husbands' last names. But I think there's still this sort of resistance to the concept of, well, why would a man change his name on marriage? And this very sort of like, sort of retrograde dual gender sort of thinking about this issue in particular. So what are some of the challenges with just keeping sort of those same cultural understandings afloat? Why is the way that we do things now so like outdated?
I think that my brother-in-law's reaction is sort of the typical explanation of really what the problem is that his response was he was upset with my husband dropping Hackey because the name would not get passed on through the generations. And I think that's sort of the big hurdle that we have yet to overcome, is that even though women have a lot more freedom to keep their own names, to hyphenate, to change their names, right? To sort of, they have a number of options. We know that children are still getting the surnames of their fathers. Mm-hmm. So in the 1970s, the feminists thought, well, if women start keeping their own names, kids will start getting names that are passed either matrilineally or patrilineally, and that just hasn't happened. They're still coming through fathers. And so that was sort of the big pushback we got, right, is, well, Hackey is dying as a last name. It won't get passed on if you have sons, mm-hmm. and then those sons won't pass it on, right? So that's sort of, I think, the big thing we have to confront of, if we want people to blend surnames. And of course, I don't think that's for everyone. I think it was for us.
I mean, you're not mandating that everyone blends surnames, you
right.
know?
And I think it's sort of only if it works for you as a couple. And for us, it worked because we knew we wanted to have kids and we knew we wanted to share names. Each of us felt strongly that we wanted to have the shared surname with our children. But I think that naming of children is still such an emotional thing because especially with sons, you think about passing through generations.
And I also think, and you make this point in your paper too, that the way that we sort of look at, this very dual gendered sort of way of thinking of, last names and surnames and changing them upon marriage, and thinking of these sorts of gender norms, it's not really reflective of what marriage is today, right? You've got same-sex couples who finally are able to get married without any problems. Other sorts of family structures out there where, someone might not want to adopt a spouse's last name or something like that. Could you comment maybe more on that too?
Yeah, I talked briefly in the paper about same-sex couples. We, of course, don't have a ton of data because we don't have a ton of years in which same-sex couples have been able to be married. But even now that sort of marriage is on the table, same-sex couples are not choosing the same surname in the way that different sex couples do, right? So they're not doing sort of wholeheartedly jumping into either hyphenating or choosing one name over the other. And the few surveys that have been done indicate that they don't identify having a shared surname as a critical part of kind of committing to marriage. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you ask, if you do sort of a general population poll, men especially think that it's an important thing that you should share a surname because it shows a commitment to marriage, but even women will say that it is an important aspect.
Okay. I think it was really funny how you cited a few sort of real world examples of this sort of persistent gender norm, especially when you have, different sex couples who are getting married. A few examples that you had from Etsy actually were really interesting, in showing how much this is still such a strong part of the culture, I think, in this country. Things like, he stole my heart, so I'm going to steal his last name on like t-shirts and weird stuff like that.
Yeah. So it's something that I've seen kind of like all over Facebook, right? It's one of those things of when you do your wedding announcements of the dates, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm stealing his last name on September 29th. And it's like, sort of, that's your date announcement for your wedding and that kind of thing but it is just fascinating that I steal his name is such a large part of our culture, right? And in my mind, of course, there's nothing wrong with you adopting your spouse's name. I adopted half of my spouse's name, right? I think that's a fine choice to make, but it is fascinating that there's been so many fights about surname choices, and yet it's so embedded in our culture. And the polls don't even just show that people think women should adopt their husband's name, but they should actually be legally required to do so.
Wow.
And I've actually met one woman who at the time would have been in her mid-20s who told me that she thought she had to take her husband's name.
Really?
She was shocked that you had an option not to.
Huh. Interesting.
Right. And that's fascinating. It's just, it's so embedded in the culture that some people don't even stop to think about it or contemplate.
Oh, that's really fascinating. And that kind of gets to the point, and we'll bring this up later when we talk about your proposal with regard to how to implement policy change when it comes to allowing for blended surnames along with other sorts of changes in surnames, but sort of giving people some really practical and easy to understand guidance on how to go about doing that. Because if you look at some of these statutes, they're not necessarily the clearest things ever, are they? I want to talk about the 4 states that allow people to do this now: California, Kansas, New York, and North Dakota in particular. And this started in New York in particular, right?
Yeah, it started in New York. 1985 is the year that they passed their laws. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of good legislative history that tells us why this blended surname piece was put into it. We know sort of broadly the legislation was sort of meant to be progressive and
Mm-hmm.
allow people choices at marriage and allow some better accounting, because now the marriage license itself would reflect the surname, but we just don't know why they put blending in there. And the sponsor is deceased, so we can't go and ask the sponsor exactly why they put that language in there.
I mean, it's interesting looking at his statement on reasons for support, where he talks about the fact that, most people are unaware of their rights regarding name changes. And, it makes me think of that anecdote that you were just talking about with that young woman who didn't know that she even could do that. So, I think this is a very long-running problem. The next state's North Dakota, correct?
Yeah. So North Dakota passed their law in 1993. And really the motivation there seemed to be that a DMV worker had gone to their local senator and said, look, we're having problems because we just don't have good information on the names that people want. Because North Dakota was like most other states are now, which is you put your old names on the marriage license and you don't indicate what your new name's going to be. And so in North Dakota, they had this issue and they just wanted to update the marriage license to include the name you would have after marriage. And then they list out options.
Yeah.
And one of those options, again, is blending surnames. And again, the sponsor is deceased. And so we don't have good information of like, well, why did you put in
this blended surname option? Yeah.
Now, they talk about New York in the official legislative history, but they don't explicitly say, well, we looked at New York's list and just adopted it wholeheartedly. But they do refer and they talk about the New York model.
Interesting. Now, I find the one person who, voted against the bill, and her rationale very interesting. Could you explain that for us?
Yeah, so there was one one representative in North Dakota who voted against the bill. And she voted against it because she actually thought that it was bad for women. And the reason is that she says only women change their names at marriage, which is statistically pretty true, right?
Yeah.
Especially at that time, 1993, men are not changing their names at marriage. And what she says is it puts too much of a burden on a woman to decide at the moment of marriage what she's going to do with her surname. So it's easy to kind of say that's terrible reasoning. And definitely in hindsight, in like 2019, that's terrible because at this point we know that North Dakota gives good options, right?
Exactly.
It lets men and women sort of have more options. But in the context of women I know who've changed their names, I do find it interesting because I've had friends who have gotten married and they weren't exactly sure what they were going to do. And so they kind of thought about it for a while, but they never had to put their new name on the marriage certificate.
Okay.
So they didn't have to make a decision until they actually went to the DMV and said, hey, update my license, right? Yeah. So it's interesting because it's sort of like, well, she may have a point, but that point doesn't make sense in 2019 when both men and women might change their names.
Yeah, yeah. I initially read that and I was like, what is she talking about? And I think it really does help to understand that objection in context that way. Yeah, absolutely.
Because under the old system or the system in place in most states, you just don't write down any name. You just don't. There's no box on the marriage
It's not
license,
indicated
right?
whatsoever. Yeah.
And so you could be either maiden name or married name, or for a lot of women, you might be both in various situations because your marriage license doesn't 100% identify what your name is.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So let's talk about Kansas real quick. So how did this come about? So
Kansas passes a law in 2007, and Kansas is where I found the most information because I was actually able to talk to Kevin Yoder, who was a state representative at the time. He just actually finished a few years serving as a federal representative, but in 2007, he was a new law school graduate, a new state representative, and him and his wife had recently gotten married. So she was from Kentucky, and like a lot of women from the South, she actually went by her middle name. So when they went to get married, she wanted to switch her middle name to her first name and then take Yoder as her last name and sort of switch her name around a little bit, right? Okay. Nothing that sounds too dramatic or terrible.
Yeah.
But they got married in Kansas and they filled out that standard marriage license where you put down your current name and you don't write down any future name.
Yeah.
And so she takes it to the DMV, and the DMV is like, well, I'm not going to make your middle name your first name. I'm not allowed to do that.
Okay.
And so Representative Yoder was kind of like, first, it's a problem that the clerk at the DMV is making this decision.
Yeah.
And second, there's no official document that says this, right? So Yoder then, when a bill came up that was like really about kind of other stuff, about the marriage license, he kind of inserted this language that allowed for a number of surname options.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses the language of derivatives thereof.
Okay.
So he doesn't use blended, but he uses derivatives thereof. And in talking with him, it was interesting because he didn't think about that as including blended surnames.
Oh, interesting.
He thought derivatives thereof. He was thinking about switching names around like middle to first.
Okay.
Maybe old last to new middle.
So completely different name orders is what he was thinking.
Yeah, that's what he was thinking. Although sort of in talking about it, he says, well, of course, I think it should be covered.
Mm-hmm.
You know, derivatives thereof would necessarily cover blended surnames, right? It would cover the Haksgaard type situation. So that was a really interesting law for me because it was, you know, one guy had a weird experience where his wife got turned down at the DMV. And it's like, well, he makes this change in state law, which actually puts Kansas on this really good track of better marriage licenses, better options for their people.
And it was very much, you know, arose out of a, you know, very personalized problem. It's pretty funny. Let's talk about California real quick. And that they ended up changing their laws in 2007.
Yeah. So California happens very similar in time to Kansas, same year. California is the only state that changes their laws in response to a constitutional lawsuit. Mm-hmm. So in Boudet versus California Department of Health and Human Services, a groom sued because he was unable to just use the marriage certificate to go change his names. So again, remember that a wife just takes this marriage license. Yeah. She goes to the DMV and she's like, oh, that line over there that has my groom's name, I want that name.
Yeah.
I'll take that. So the groom tried to do that. Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, look at that name over there. Yeah. That's my wife's name. I want that. And of course, He's met with resistance. Yeah. You can't do that because men do not adopt wives' names.
Yeah.
And so California, before the lawsuit got terribly far, passed legislation that, again, sort of said, put your name on the marriage certificate, and here's a list of options, and one of those options is blending surnames.
Okay, great. So I want to talk about your proposal now.
Yes.
You know, and as a suggestion to the states with regard to drafting new marital surname change legislation. What's your proposal to fix all this for the other 46 states?
Yeah, so I have 4 points I make. So let me run through them. So the first thing I say is that I think that we need to clearly lay out surname options. And so that's why in the paper I draw a line between New York, North Dakota, Kansas, and California that lay them out, and then Iowa, Massachusetts, and Minnesota that say you can have any name, but don't really lay them out. So I don't think there's a problem with allowing any surname, but I think that's nice for a signaling mechanism to say, here, you can do these 3, 4, 5, 6 things, whatever the state wants to allow. Because that signals to people that, oh, you can actually do these. Yeah. And what's interesting about New York, North Dakota does the same thing, is that there's a notice to applicants. So when you go apply for your marriage license, you actually get this notice that says, here's what you can do with your surname. Huh. It is clearly laid out. You get that information, and so you just know what your options are. And I think that's very valuable, especially if you want people to consider different options and just the norm and sort of actually think about what your last name is going to be.
Yeah, because I imagine that in those states where you could just make it whatever you want, but you don't get any notice, no one's going to think about that. They're just going to go along with the sort of expected cultural norm.
Yeah. I mean, that's my personal concern is, again, not that I am encouraging anybody to do anything particular with their names, but rather I think that we should be aware that we do have some options.
Great.
So the second piece of the proposal is simply that I think that blending surnames should be an option in every state. I think that it is a way to preserve sort of your personal history, right? It preserves the surname you grew up with and that was your family name. It also allows you to connect with your children if you're going to have your children. And it allows you to share a surname with your spouse. So I think the blending aspect where you keep a piece of your old name is really valuable and can kind of maybe help that patrilineal name passage change over time, because in basically all of the other name options we see, whatever variety you come up with, again, it's the dad, husband's name who gets passed to the kids.
Great.
So the third point is that whatever name you want, whether it's blended, whether you take the groom's name, the bride's name, keep your original name, it should be reflected on the marriage license. So there should be an empty slot that says prior name, current name, and then there should be an empty spot that says name after marriage.
Okay.
So the marriage license itself reflects the name you're going to use. And then the last point is basically just, as we do this, states also need to update their divorce procedures. A lot of states still, it's kind of unclear if men can change their names at divorce. So obviously, you also have to be careful of, as you give more options at marriage, you need to give more options at divorce. And I don't get into the various issues of name changes at divorce any more than that in the paper, other than to acknowledge that if we change things on the front end of marriage, we also need to change them on the back end.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So I imagine, and I really like this proposal. I think it's great, but I imagine that there might be a few detractors who will think of some problems, especially if they're particularly wedded to that's funny. Wedded to this concept of, okay, there should only be this form of, women changing their names on marriage to a man, very old fashioned that way. And of course, I think that they'd be worried, and you point this out in your paper, about things like fraud or, difficulty with administering these changes and everything. Why are those things why should we not worry about these things?
Yeah, so I talk about fraud and administrative burden. And I think the answer to both of those is basically the same. Is first off, in every state, including the 4 states that allow surname blending, it's already illegal to change your name for fraud, right? At any point, if you go change your name, whoever is changing it, whether it's the marriage clerk or whether it's a judge, should be making sure that you're not doing it for fraudulent reasons. And we seem to assume that people who are getting married and adopting a name don't do it for fraudulent reasons. And I think that's a pretty fair assumption. There's a question of sort of, would fraud increase if at marriage both men and women change their names? And there's also a question of, well, would the administrative burden increase if now we have more men and more women changing their names at the time of marriage? I think the answer to both of those is no. And the biggest reason is that we put the new name on the marriage license. So now there is a piece of paper that I have a copy of and the government has a copy of that has my maiden name and it has my current name on it. And the same thing for my husband. And so the government can figure out my current name and my old name. And I can show that document to banks and airlines and all of this stuff. And it's very clearly reflected on that.
It seems like it would actually simplify things by centralizing all that information.
I absolutely agree with that.
Okay. This sounds like a really marked improvement that way. How about sort of these issues of just, for lack of a better way of putting it, I think some people are just scared of social change and they think that tradition is super important. What exactly do you have to say to those concerns?
Yeah. So, this is kind of the piece of it that there's not too much that's offensive about sort of women and men having different names when they're married anymore, right? Yeah. Some people still find that offensive, but I think that we've moved in a direction where folks are generally okay with that. It seems like as a society, perhaps what we're more connected to is the patrilineal passage of surnames.
Yeah.
But if you're going to reject the proposal because you want to say kids should have their father's name, well, that's an unconstitutional reason, right?
Yeah.
That's a sex discrimination. Like, that's not a good reason to say no. So basically, I make the point that if you want to reject this because you don't like the progress that it shows, you can't do it for those reasons because it'd be unconstitutional, right? But a whole big part of this is that this, of course, is not mandating anybody do anything particular with their names. It's just giving some additional options. It's saying whether same-sex or different-sex marriages, both couples or both parties to the couple can or cannot change their names, and they have a variety of options for what they can do.
Yeah, and I think, if those other arguments with regard to, look, this isn't going to increase fraud, this is going to make things like record keeping easier and everything aren't compelling to states, I imagine that advising them on how to avoid constitutional challenge, I hope that would at least get their attention, trying to kind of frame this in a, hey, this is in your own best interest.
Yeah. And I talk about the potential 14th Amendment challenge a little bit. Mm-hmm. So early on, sort of the feminists in the 1970s were making constitutional arguments. Of course, the Equal Protection Clause looked different there, but it really was at its heart an equal protection violation. In the last 15 years, men have been making equal protection arguments, right? That was the California case. That's an equal protection case because there was a clear case of a groom could not do what a bride was easily able to do. So all of the name change stuff before has been very sex-based and sex discriminatory. First, by having women have no options, and then sort of saying, men, your only option is to keep your name. And we don't have that issue with blended surnames because it's sex neutral, right? But you still might have a due process problem. Because names are important. We recognize how important names are, right? There's a number of cases about parents choosing names for kids, right? There's just a body of cases out there that basically say names are important.
And they're an important part of how you structure your family.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I'm not saying that a 14th Amendment due process challenge would necessarily be successful, but I do think it's something states should probably be on the lookout for.
They really, really should consider this, and I think I feel that more strongly even after reading this paper. Especially because I don't think that there are going to be couples coming out in droves demanding this afterward. It's just another option.
Right. It's just another option. And right. It's most people who've met me have said, wow, you're the first person I've met who've done this. Or they'll say something like, my second cousin blended surnames with his wife, right? I might be the second one, but it's not like a lot of people are doing this.
Yeah.
And even if it's an option, it doesn't make sense for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. So, why not give everyone the option that suits their own family and suits their own situation? Yeah.
Without having to go to court and publish and incur fees and appear in front of a judge, right? Because you still can do that everywhere, but that's a burden. That's more of a de minimis. It's more than a de minimis burden, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just like an easy thing that anybody can do.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the final product and seeing this paper come out in the Stanford Law and Policy Review this summer. I had the pleasure of introducing Hannah earlier in this program, but I want to congratulate her on her promotion today. She is now an associate professor, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Always nice to get good news like that. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you, Miba.
Connects our souls, water for cleaning the body flow. Being the kid once amazed with race, nice any creature lost in the maze. There is no winner when angry, no happiness entry when love's not elementary. You have to catch the waves and move in ways that make you, cause you are the greatest project. Heal the scars, forget the subject. Bring your eye and feel the blood rushing. Love and I'm crazy. Nothing on away from karma. Evolution's an alarm now. Feel the fluid in your veins.